Living under an HOA had always been a minor inconvenience, but I never imagined it would escalate to the point where I'd have to fight for the right to keep my own car in my garage. For the most part, the HOA was just an overreaching committee that sent out passive-aggressive emails about grass length, trash cans, and the color of mailboxes. Annoying, yes, but nothing I couldn't ignore. That all changed when Richard, the newly appointed HOA board member, decided that my car was an unacceptable presence in the neighborhood. I had lived in this community for nearly 5 years, and in all that time, no one had ever complained about my car. It was a sleek, deep blue sports sedan that I had worked years to afford. Sure, it wasn't the typical beige or white minivan most of my neighbors drove, but it wasn't some obnoxious, blaring hot rod either. To me, it was just a car. To Richard, it was a problem that had to be corrected. The first warning came in the form of a formal HOA letter left on my doorstep. The document, stamped with the association's official logo, was worded in the kind of legalese that made it sound more important than it actually was. The gist of it was simple. My vehicle was deemed to be in violation of community aesthetic standards and had to be removed from public visibility within 10 days. At first, I thought it was a joke. Aesthetic standards? What did that even mean? My car wasn't covered in graffiti or blasting music through massive speakers. It was a normal, well-maintained vehicle. I took the letter inside, showed it to my grandmother, who had moved in with me a few months prior, and expected her to laugh it off. Instead, she squinted at it and muttered, "This is how they start, you know? First, they make up some nonsense rule, then they push it until you give in. Next thing you know, they're running your entire life." My grandmother wasn't the type to back down from a fight, and I could already see that she was taking this more seriously than I was. I shrugged it off and tossed the letter aside, figuring I would call the HOA office the next day and clear up whatever ridiculous misunderstanding this was. The next morning, I dialed the number listed on the letter and was immediately met with a monotone voicemail message about HOA office hours. When I finally got through to a human, I was greeted by a woman named Susan, the HOA secretary, who spoke to me like I was an unruly child in need of discipline. "Your vehicle has been flagged as a visual disruption to the neighborhood," she explained in a tone dripping with condescension. "A visual disruption?" I repeated, struggling to keep my voice even. "What does that even mean?" Susan sighed as if she had dealt with this question too many times before. "Certain vehicles do not align with the community's overall aesthetic harmony. We strive to maintain a consistent image, and unfortunately, your car does not meet those standards." I scoffed. "Are you serious? It's just a sports sedan. There are people in this neighborhood with massive trucks and SUVs. Why aren't they getting letters?" "That's not for you to worry about," Susan replied briskly. "The board has made a decision. You have until the stated deadline to remove the vehicle, or we will take appropriate measures." "Appropriate measures?" My grip on the phone tightened. "Are you threatening to tow my car?" "If necessary," she said, completely unfazed. "We have authority over all properties in the HOA, including vehicles that are deemed non-compliant." At that point, I knew I wasn't going to get anywhere with her, so I ended the call before I said something I'd regret. I spent the rest of the day fuming. There was no way they had the legal authority to just tow my car from my own garage, right? I decided to dig into the HOA bylaws, searching for any clause that would back up their ridiculous claim. What I found was even more absurd than I expected. There was, in fact, a rule about vehicle compliance, but it was vague and clearly written in a way that allowed the HOA board to interpret it however they pleased. The key phrase that stood out was "vehicles that disrupt the intended aesthetic of the neighborhood may be subject to removal." This was insanity. The rule was so broad that they could target anyone they didn't like. If they wanted to, they could probably decide that someone's bicycle was a disruption and get rid of it. I wasn't going to let them bully me into submission, so I did what any reasonable person would do. I ignored them. I figured they would eventually get tired of sending letters and move on to harassing someone else. But Richard wasn't the type to let things go. A few days later, I woke up to find a massive red sticker plastered across my garage door that read "Violation. Final warning." The notice was even more aggressive than before, stating that my vehicle was now subject to immediate action and that the HOA had the right to resolve the matter as deemed necessary. I ripped the sticker down and stormed over to Richard's house. He lived just a few houses down from me, in a pristine, soulless cookie-cutter home that looked straight out of a luxury real estate ad. The kind of house that screamed HOA puppet. When he answered the door, he had a smug, knowing look on his face, as if he had been expecting me. "Morning," he said casually, leaning against his doorframe. "Something I can help you with?" "You know damn well why I'm here," I snapped, shoving the notice into his chest. "What the hell is this?" Richard didn't even bother to look at it. "That's an official notice from the HOA," he said, unfazed. "You were warned multiple times. Now we're taking action." "You can't just take my car," I said, my voice rising. "It's private property. You have no legal grounds." Richard smirked, folding his arms across his chest. "Actually, we do. As per the HOA bylaws, vehicles that violate community standards are subject to immediate removal. You signed the agreement when you moved in, which means you agreed to abide by our regulations. If you have a problem with that, you're welcome to take it up with the board. But trust me, the board supports this decision." I wanted to punch that smug look right off his face, but I knew that wouldn't get me anywhere. Instead, I turned and walked away, seething. By the time I got back home, my grandmother was waiting for me on the porch, arms crossed. "I take it they're doubling down?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. I exhaled sharply. "They're threatening to tow my car. Richard basically told me there's nothing I can do about it." My grandmother's eyes narrowed. "Oh, there's plenty we can do about it," she said. "These people think they can push us around? They have no idea who they're dealing with." That was when I saw something flicker in her expression, something I hadn't seen in a long time. A spark of defiance. My grandmother was not someone you wanted to mess with. She had spent decades fighting battles far bigger than a petty HOA dispute, and she wasn't about to let some self-important suburban dictator walk all over us. I had no idea at the time, but my grandmother was about to take things to a whole new level. And Richard? He had no idea what was coming for him. The days that followed felt like living in enemy territory. I knew the HOA was serious about trying to seize my car, but I wasn't prepared for how brazen they would get. Richard wasn't bluffing, he was escalating. The first sign came when I noticed a black SUV with tinted windows slowly driving past my house multiple times a day. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, but my security cameras confirmed it. The vehicle never stopped, never lingered long enough to be suspicious, but it circled my property in a way that felt intentional. My grandmother noticed too, and she wasn't one to keep her thoughts to herself. "We used to have people like this back in my day," she muttered, watching the SUV from the window, her fingers tapping against the wooden cane she always carried. "Always thought they were above the law. Always thought they could take what they wanted just because nobody had the guts to stop them." I was about to brush it off, tell her it was nothing, when the next event changed everything. It was just after midnight when my phone buzzed with an alert from my security system. "Motion detected, garage door." I sat up instantly, heart hammering. I pulled up the live feed on my phone, expecting to see maybe an animal or a glitch in the system. Instead, I saw Richard and another man standing in my driveway. They were dressed in dark clothing, both wearing gloves, and Richard was holding something long and metallic in his hands, a crowbar. My stomach twisted in disbelief. They were breaking into my garage. I jumped out of bed, adrenaline spiking. "They're here," I said, shaking my grandmother awake. "Richard, he's actually doing it?" She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She just swung her legs over the side of the bed and reached for her cane. "Call the cops," she said, her voice eerily calm. My thoughts scrambled. Should I confront them? Should I grab something for self-defense? But my grandmother was already heading for the door. She wasn't moving like an old woman. She was moving with purpose. I pulled up the security feed again as we reached the hallway. The garage camera showed Richard wedging the crowbar into the side of the door, grunting as he tried to force it open. His partner, a shorter, stocky man I didn't recognize, kept looking over his shoulder, nervously scanning the street. "This is insane," I whispered. "He's actually trying to steal my car." My grandmother, however, wasn't whispering. She threw open the front door with enough force to make it bang against the wall. "Itchy," she barked, her voice sharp as a whip crack. Both men froze. I barely had time to process what happened next. Instead of staying put or calling for backup, my grandmother marched right into the driveway. Richard turned, still holding the crowbar, his mouth opening in shock. His partner took a step back, eyes wide with panic. "You got about 3 seconds to get off this property before I make you regret the day you were born," my grandmother growled, gripping her cane like a weapon. Richard blinked, recovering from his shock. "This is official HOA business," he said, straightening his posture like he had any authority left. "You don't have the right to interfere." That was the wrong thing to say. My grandmother charged forward. And I swear to God, I have never seen an old woman move that fast. With a speed that defied every expectation, she swung her cane like a baseball bat and cracked it against Richard's hand. The crowbar clattered to the ground. Richard screamed. His partner? He ran. The guy bolted the second my grandmother attacked, sprinting down the street like his life depended on it. Richard meanwhile stumbled back, cradling his wrist. "Why, you crazy old hag," he sputtered. "You just assaulted me?" My grandmother took a slow step forward, rolling her shoulders like she was warming up for another hit. "You broke into my grandson's garage," she shot back. "You're lucky I didn't bring my shotgun." At that point I had to intervene. Not because I wanted to save Richard, but because I had no idea how far my grandmother was willing to take this. I stepped outside, phone still in my hand, already dialing the police. "Richard," I said, keeping my voice calm, "you need to leave. Now." Richard looked between us, his face a mixture of humiliation and fear. He tried to salvage the situation, squaring his shoulders. "You don't understand. This is a violation of HOA protocol. You're the ones breaking the rules." "Buddy," I said, pointing to my phone. "I have everything on camera. You just broke into my property on video. Do you really think the cops are going to give a damn about HOA rules?" His face drained of color. For the first time since this nightmare started, I saw genuine panic in his eyes. He knew he was screwed. My grandmother took another step forward, tilting her head. "Are you still standing here?" she asked. "You must really want that second beating." Richard stumbled backward, then turned and ran. I swear I had never seen a grown man run that fast. He bolted down the street, disappearing into the night, leaving his crowbar behind. I looked at my grandmother, who was breathing hard but otherwise completely unfazed. She nudged the crowbar with her cane, muttering, "Coward." The cops arrived 15 minutes later. I showed them the security footage, explained what had happened, and, unsurprisingly, they took my side. Richard had committed trespassing, attempted burglary, and property damage, all of which were criminal offenses. But when the police went to Richard's house to arrest him, he was gone. Vanished. The next morning, an emergency HOA meeting was called. Word had spread fast about what happened, and for the first time, Richard wasn't in charge. The tables were finally turning. And my grandmother? She was just getting started. The morning after Richard's failed break-in and humiliating defeat at the hands of my grandmother, the neighborhood was already buzzing with the news. I hadn't even shared the security footage yet, but somehow multiple neighbors had already seen the videos from their own cameras and had started talking. My phone was flooded with texts from people in the community who had witnessed Richard lurking around before, and now that his actions had escalated into an actual crime, no one was willing to stay silent. While I was still groggy from the chaos of the night before, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number, and when I answered, I was met with a deep, serious voice on the other end. "This is Officer Bradley from the local precinct. We need you to come in to give a full statement." I had expected this call, but what I hadn't expected was what he said next. A warrant had been issued for Richard's arrest. The charges? Breaking and entering, attempted grand theft auto, property damage, and trespassing. My grandmother, who was sitting across from me, sipping her usual morning tea like nothing had happened, let out a satisfied hum before muttering, "Good. Now we make sure he never comes back." But while Richard was now officially a wanted criminal, the HOA was already scrambling to protect itself. That became clear when I checked my email and saw a sudden announcement for an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for later that morning. They were panicking. They knew their golden boy had finally gone too far, and now that the law was involved, they were trying to distance themselves from the fallout. I didn't trust them for a second. My grandmother had warned me that they'd try to spin it like it was my fault, and she was absolutely right. When I walked into the HOA meeting room, the atmosphere was thick with unease. Normally, the board members sat with an air of smug authority, but today? They looked nervous. At exactly 11 a.m., the HOA president, Walter Green, cleared his throat and began in a rehearsed, robotic voice. "As many of you may have heard, there was an incident last night involving a former board member and an alleged act of trespassing." Alleged? I almost laughed. I had the whole thing on camera. Walter continued with his PR damage control. "We want to assure the community that this was an isolated incident and does not reflect the values of the HOA or its leadership." I shot up my hand. "So you're throwing Richard under the bus now? Just like that?" My voice cut through the murmurs in the room. Walter hesitated for a fraction of a second, then squared his shoulders. "We are simply acknowledging that his actions were encouraged by the HOA. I interrupted. "You gave him the power to harass homeowners. You backed him when he tried to illegally seize my car. And now that he's a wanted felon, you're pretending he was acting alone?" More murmurs spread through the crowd, and I could see some of the neighbors nodding along. I pressed forward, pulling out my phone and opening an email Richard had sent me a week earlier, threatening to tow my car under the HOA's authority. Without breaking eye contact with Walter, I read it out loud. The room fell silent. Walter's face turned pale. I had him. Sounds like you were plenty aware, I said, crossing my arms. Sounds like you supported it. And then, something surprising happened. A woman, one of the HOA board members, stood up and spoke. I wanted on record that I did not support Richard's actions, she said firmly. And I refuse to be part of an HOA that enables this kind of abuse. She quit on the spot. And she wasn't alone. One by one, 3 more board members stood up and resigned, each stating they wanted nothing to do with the corruption that had just been exposed. Walter, now looking like a man on a sinking ship, tried to regain control, but it was too late. The HOA was falling apart. And it was glorious. But I wasn't done yet. I left that meeting and headed straight to the police station to give my official statement. The moment I arrived, Officer Bradley greeted me with a knowing nod. You'll be happy to know, he said, we've issued the warrant. Now it's just a matter of finding him. I handed over all my security footage, the email evidence, and statements from multiple neighbors who had witnessed Richard's harassment leading up to the break-in. As it turned out, Richard had been up to a lot more than just targeting me. He had been embezzling HOA funds for years, using bribes to get towing companies to illegally remove people's vehicles, and doctoring documents to pressure homeowners into selling their properties. This wasn't just about a petty HOA dispute anymore. Richard was going to prison. That night, I got another call from Officer Bradley. We found him, he said, and I could hear the smirk in his voice. He was hiding out in a cheap motel under a fake name. Someone recognized him and called it in. I imagined Richard sitting in some dingy room watching his whole world collapse. Couldn't have happened to a better guy. But the HOA? They weren't done yet. In a last-ditch effort to save themselves, they did something so ridiculous I couldn't believe it. They sent me a fine. A $5,000 fine for disrupting community order. I laughed out loud. Instead of paying, I did something better. I sent copies of the fine to every local news outlet. Within a week, the story was everywhere. HOA board member arrested for corruption and theft. Local hero and his grandmother take down HOA tyrant. The HOA was officially collapsing. And then my grandmother, who had been silent through this part of the battle, decided it was time to strike. She walked straight into Walter's office, slammed the fine down on his desk and said, "You have 2 choices. Either you shut this HOA down, or I make sure you wish you had." Walter resigned the next day. And just like that, the HOA was no more. Richard was in jail. The HOA was dissolved. And my grandmother? She went right back to drinking her tea like nothing had happened. When I asked her if she felt satisfied, she just shrugged and said, "Well, I told you I wasn't gonna let them take your car." Legend. With Richard now rotting in jail and the HOA in a state of total disarray, I thought the war was over, but my grandmother, ever the unyielding force of nature, saw things differently. "Mark my words," she muttered one morning over her tea, her eyes sharp with the kind of wisdom that only comes from decades of fighting battles no one else dared to fight. "These people aren't done yet. You think they'll just let go of their little kingdom? No. They're going to try and crawl their way back." And of course she was right. Even after Richard's public downfall, Walter's humiliating resignation, and half the board members quitting out of sheer embarrassment, there were still a handful of die-hard HOA loyalists clinging to the delusion that they could somehow revive their sinking ship. Their first move was a series of desperate letters sent out to every homeowner in the neighborhood, filled with flowery nonsense about how the HOA was undergoing reorganization and that it was time to restore order in the community. No one bought it. The neighborhood had already tasted freedom, and there was no way we were going back to being ruled by a bunch of power-hungry busybodies. But my grandmother wasn't about to just sit back and hope for the best. No, she had a plan. And like every great strategist, she moved with precision and ruthless efficiency. It started with a lawsuit. See, what the HOA didn't realize was that while Richard had been their most visible enforcer, he was far from the only corrupt one among them. Over the years, the HOA had been bleeding homeowners dry with bogus fines, illegal towing, and fraudulent charges. And thanks to Richard's arrest, all of their shady practices were now under scrutiny. My grandmother, leading the charge like a 5-star general, worked with a local attorney to file a massive class action lawsuit against the HOA, listing 32 homeowners as plaintiffs. The case? Absolutely airtight. We had mountains of evidence: fraudulent financial records, illegally enforced fines, bribery payments to towing companies, and even emails proving that Walter and his goons had been fabricating violations to pressure people into selling their homes. It was an absolute goldmine of corruption, and once we filed the lawsuit, everything changed. The remaining HOA members panicked. They had no leadership, no legal defense, and worst of all, no money. With Richard and Walter gone, they had no one left to shield them. They tried one last pathetic move, a community vote to elect new leadership and rebuild the HOA from the ground up. It was a joke. No one showed up to vote. Except my grandmother. She strolled into the so-called emergency HOA meeting, took a seat at the front, and when the last desperate HOA members tried to rally support, she calmly stood up, adjusted her cardigan, and annihilated them. "You think people want this back?" she asked, her voice razor-sharp. "You think after years of abuse, fines, and corruption, we're just going to hand control back to you?" She let that hang in the air for a second before she pulled out a petition, a fully signed petition from over 87% of the neighborhood, calling for the HOA's complete dissolution. "It's over," she said. "You lost." And just like that, the HOA was officially dead. They had no money to fight back, no legal standing to challenge the petition, and no support left in the community. Within a month, the HOA was legally dissolved. No more inspections. No more ridiculous fines. No more petty tyrants with clipboards measuring the height of our grass. But my grandmother wasn't finished yet. She wanted to make sure these people never recovered. And so, she made one last move. She personally tracked down every homeowner who had ever been wronged by the HOA and convinced them to join the lawsuit. The case made its way through the courts, and 6 months later, the final ruling came down like a hammer. The former HOA board members were ordered to pay back every cent they had ever stolen through fraudulent fines, illegal fees, and unauthorized charges. The total amount? 6 figures. Richard, still sitting in jail, had his remaining assets cease to pay his share. Walter, who had been hoping to slink away quietly, was forced to sell his house to cover his debts. And the remaining HOA members? They vanished. Too ashamed to show their faces, they either moved out of the neighborhood or kept their heads down forever. And the best part? The former HOA couldn't even legally reform. Thanks to the lawsuit, the HOA was permanently barred from re-establishing itself. The neighborhood was free. And it stayed that way. The changes were immediate. People painted their homes whatever colors they wanted. They put up garden gnomes, installed fountains, planted whatever they damn well pleased. The entire feel of the neighborhood changed. It was no longer a place where you had to worry about petty fines and power-hungry board members. It was finally a community again. And my grandmother? She became a legend. People waved to her when she walked by, thanking her for standing up to the HOA. One guy even suggested renaming the neighborhood park after her. She just laughed it off, but I could tell she was secretly pleased. And my car? It stayed exactly where it was. In fact, just despite the HOA one last time, I went out and bought another car, an even louder, flashier, more obnoxious sports car, and parked it right in my driveway. No one said a word. The war was over. The HOA was gone. The community was ours again. And my grandmother, the undisputed queen of our victory, just went back to drinking her tea like nothing had happened. When I asked her if she was satisfied with how things turned out, she just patted my hand, smiled, and said, "I told you, dear. Sometimes, people just need to be reminded that they aren't as powerful as they think they are."